right, so today we talk to Alex Dixon. Hi, Alex.
Hi.
Alex is a software developer at Co-Narrative in Sacramento, California. He wrote Precept, a reactive declarative programming framework in Clojure and ClojureScript that brings rule-based logic programming to React apps. He has a Bachelor of Arts in English from University of Berkeley. So this episode is the season finale, and we will move away from why and what is ClojureScript and focus on an experience report of using ClojureScript, then coming back to JavaScript and how it feels. So what is important, I think, to point out is that we are not trying to make fun of JavaScript because me and Alex are JavaScript developers as well. So even though we might sound like anti-JS in this episode, we're really not. It's just an observation and experience. So Alex, why don't we just start maybe with your background?
Sure. I for work, right, primarily in JavaScript, and that's where I started out. Started out with React. Was a sort of early adopter of Redux, and since then, I've tried to keep up with all the latest and greatest JavaScript stuff, which is a full-time job. I mean, they have such a great community. We've gotten GraphQL, had a chance to use that in a project. All the various Redux frameworks, Redux Saga, and a lot of the utility libraries that I mentioned in the article for functional programming. I've used Immutable JS back when that was
Right.
a little more popular, and Lodash sort of in between, and then eventually have sort of settled for work on Ramda. I do work in other languages. I was just working on, some C# stuff this morning, written an app for work in Clojure. I had many, pretty much anything that I would do in my spare time, I would hope would be in Clojure. Been working on a Rust project. Generally, my background is web programming and with JavaScript.
So the article that Alex mentioned is called Functional Programming in JavaScript is an Anti-Pattern. And when I found this article, I felt like you just put in words what I had for a long time in my head. So it was just the experience that you just read something and someone just wrote something that you thought about for a long time but didn't know how to put it into words. So what is for you functional programming? What kind of building blocks would you say are needed for functional programming? And of course, this is on a high level. We not try to define everything and be correct by all means.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it comes across in the article that immutability, immutable data structures are something that I presume, should be part of functional programming. And, that doesn't have to be part of, every definition and way of thinking about functional programming at all. But it's come to be that for me. Clojure was my first sort of foray into a functional programming language, and they have immutable data structures. Beyond that, like your program being composed of basically two things, functions and data.
Mm-hmm.
And the functions in your program operate over your data. They transform values and return new values. Obviously, you're going to need to have some state, and you're going to need to do some kind of mutation, but you try to express that, I think, in a using pure functions as much as you can, and when you can't, you try and isolate that, so what parts of your program are doing that scary mutation type stuff.
Right. So would it be fair to say, like, of course, React and Redux are this functional pattern where you have those actions and then you just operate on the Redux state. And this is the pattern we are talking about. But on top of this, what you're adding is that we should also have these immutable or functional data structures. And so what's the point where you started to think about this and what brought you to writing this article?
Well, it was, right after I had spent a fair amount of time in Clojure and ClojureScript, after being a JS developer for a while, and then I went back to JavaScript and tried writing code, and it was just a totally different experience for me, and I noticed things that I hadn't really before I started working with Clojure. I think one of the big things was the lack of standard library with filter for various different types of data structures, map, just normal things that seem to me at that point just to be normal things that a language should have. Certainly, if it's a functional programming language, I would need to use third-party libraries, and then it becomes a question of which third-party library do you use. Do those third-party libraries are they treating data as immutable? Are they doing that sometimes but not others? Do they have their own data structures, like in the case of Immutable JS? And obviously, any program that tries to incorporate all of those is kind of a mess, and you probably shouldn't do that. But it came at a time where it wasn't clear. Like, I think everybody was thinking, functional programming in JavaScript is something that's going to save us. Is my impression of the community, and I was, fully on board with that. But how exactly that goes, what that looks like in JavaScript in particular, was just kind of fractured and not as unified as my experience in Clojure script. And just way more friction for me for doing some very very basic list transformations and stuff. I really noticed that there was a lot of cognitive overhead for me associated with doing that. At that point.
Right. I think you mentioned that you need to pull in like different libraries to do math filter reduce. I think it will be good to clarify that in ClojureScript, you have those math filter reduce that work on all kinds of collections, be it a map, meaning a JavaScript object, or being a vector JavaScript array. You just have a standard library. So this is the Clojure core that works on all of those collections. And it doesn't really matter what kind of data structure you pass to it. It just works. So in JavaScript, you always have to pull in like Lodash or Lambda or something like this. So just to have this abstraction over all of the data structure. I think the ES 2016, I don't remember now, introduced this object items and object keys and object values.
Yeah.
But still, exactly,
But
this is the
what,
point. I think that it's, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, it's a good point. I mean, and that's just another way of sort of doing something in Clojure where it's just like, well, there's pretty much one way to do it, more or less. I mean, that's not entirely true, but I mean, I wouldn't have to think in Clojure like, do I want to use object.entries or object.keys.map or anything like that, or do I want to use a utility library? Pretty much what I'm looking for is already there for me, and it's just like the primitive functions that make up the language, map, filter, reduce, etc. So
You mentioned all of those libraries like React, Redux. I mean, they require immutability by convention, but we can still like change them, right? We can still mutate this stuff. You just switch between mutable and immutable world in JavaScript most of the time. Or if you use immutable JS, you just need to learn totally new API.
basically, I've heard an argument that immutability by convention is not really immutability. It's not the type of immutability that we're talking about, because it gives you a choice and it gives you, the ability to mess up and have errors in your program, mutate something when you didn't expect to. And with the exception, as far as I know, with the exception of Immutable JS, immutability in JavaScript is by convention.
Right.
We could get into other things like it's not the most performant implementation because there's no structural sharing. You're basically creating new objects here and there and everywhere, which creates a lot of work for the garbage collector, as opposed to Clojure's implementation, which uses structural sharing. Immutable JS, I think, is modeled after Clojure's data structures, and so you do get some of that structural sharing goodness. But it's at the cost of I can no longer and furthermore, Immutable JS, it's like you don't really have. They have an API for like as mutable, I think, but you don't really have an option. You're not going to accidentally mutate something because the data structures are defined as immutable. The downside is with Immutable.js, it doesn't interoperate with these other libraries. You can't use filter or anything from Ramda or Lodash, insofar as I know. They don't work together because Ramda and Lodash are meant to operate over JavaScript data structures, not these special immutable data structures. So it puts you in a situation then where if you're going to use, if you want true immutable data structures in JavaScript, you're going to need to use something like Immutable.js, it seems, where they have their own API that then you have to learn. You can't use with sort of the stuff that you already know, maybe Lodash, maybe Ramda, and you're kind of stuck with that.
Right. Seems like we should have another library that works on the immutable JS collections, that can do all the functional operations.
Well, yeah. I think that there could be something to that. In my opinion, like maybe instead of writing this article, I should be writing something that tries to solve the problem. But at the time, it just seemed to me that we're just pushing the problem around and trying to solve these little pieces of it, and then that begets another problem, and then we try and solve that, and ad infinitum. And I feel like ultimately that Clojure and ClojureScript solves those problems at the root, basically.
Right.
So you're not like in this situation where it really feels like you're chasing your tail and just going around and around and not able to escape out of this inconvenience.
Right. Yeah, I feel like ClojureScript is just in so polar opposite to like JavaScript, where JavaScript just tries to like patch the language with the libraries, those fundamental concepts like the data structures and the functional stuff like map filter and stuff like this, where the ClojureScript is like, well, this is baked in, and what we want to do with libraries, we just want to have libraries on a higher level of abstraction. So the core language is pretty well thought out and pretty well designed.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an understatement to me, because that's one of the. I feel like it's a master planned sort of language where it's just so well designed, and that it was, not like let's bolt on something here, let's add object dot entries, let's add array dot flat map and whatever as time is gone along. It's had the benefit of all of that stuff being figured out in the dark when I think Chicky was working on it, and then figuring out all of that stuff sort of in your head, the way things should be, and then having the language come out just really well designed and planned for that stuff.
Yeah, so this is one thing you mentioned, that you try to stitch those libraries together, but they just have different semantics and stuff like this. So this is one thing. Another thing is that there is different. You never know if the map should go at front or at the beginning, if you pass the collection first or last. So
Yeah,
the order of the arguments is different.
yeah. So the more APIs that I had to be familiar with for work, and I don't think this is a normal situation necessarily, where you might have all of those floating around in your head at once, but you still might have like two, and it's like I'd rather just have one way of doing things, because I don't have to think as much. But yeah, I mean, at the time, I was switching between projects that were using like Lodash and Ramda, for example, and even Lodash FP. And Lodash FP has, I think, its collection arguments last. I think Ramda has its collection arguments last. Lodash, um, vanilla has its collection arguments first. Immutable.js, it's like you call dot filter, I think, on the data structures. It's just all of this, different syntax that, for me was really hard to, I mean, I could figure it out, but it kind of wasted some time, like, should I really have to be thinking about that instead of the problem that I'm trying to solve? And I think that was going off of with Clojure. I would just get into this flow where I don't have to think about those things, and the language just kind of
Right.
faded into the background, and it was just this beautiful experience. When I got back into JavaScript, it was very much like I'm sort of arguing with the language and trying
Right.
to figure out what is what, with the
Yeah,
syntax.
yeah. I think you need to keep a lot in your head, so your cognitive load must be very high when you just use all of those libraries, and just as you said, you just either you need to learn them or you always need to look up the documentation. And there the point comes, as you mentioned, it's like, shouldn't I be working on my business logic and figuring out how to solve the problem instead of thinking about the library? So what do you think are the long-term costs of this?
Well, yeah, I think I forget exactly what I was thinking about when I wrote the article, but I guess I just wonder, can we fix this in JavaScript,
Hmm.
or would a higher level language like Clojure script be a better solution? And where it seems to address, some of these problems that I think are like root problems that are hard for us in user land or library land to kind of find our way out of. And I was
Mm.
thinking long term in terms of, JavaScript is, immensely popular, and what's the end to that story? You know, in 2058, are we still writing JavaScript, or has another language come along that's gained popularity that is substantially different? Maybe, heck, maybe it compiles to JavaScript, fine. But yeah, where as and I think as developers, we're going to, if not determine that, then greatly influence it. So I think it's a question for me of kind of where do we want to go? Are we happy with this? Does anybody else feel the way that I do about this? Am I just crazy? I and I think there are costs to it in terms of personally, it's and for anybody else that feels frustrated by JavaScript, like it's just kind of emotionally draining sometimes to have to
Raining.
argue with the language. I think I think we could be more productive potentially, in Clojure script, frankly. um,
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree here. And we're just talking about the language level. And then when I think about all of the frameworks that are there and then all of the build tools and all of this stuff, it's just in every corner of, I feel, JavaScript, there's just so much churn and so much also constant change to keep up with everything. It's also sometimes I wonder how people find the time actually to do actual work instead of learning new stuff. What do you think is the problem of adopting Clojure?
the way I see it is like it's a circular problem having to do with popularity. And I think that basically people will say, I'm not going to use Clojure script or for this project, or try Clojure script because it's not popular. And JavaScript is more popular. And the problem with that is that they're right, for one, and that there are benefits, I think, to a language being popular, but that subscribing to that way of thinking, like, you'll notice it has nothing to do about the virtues of the language itself. It has nothing to do with basically how good a language it is. It's just how popular is it? What do other people think
Right.
about it? Um,
Mm.
and that the consequence is the language doesn't get more popular. And if the only way that it can be more popular is it's to get more popular is to be popular, I mean, we're just caught in this circular problem where that's it's unclear how that can change if everybody uses that type of reasoning. yeah, I think I was trying to, put that out there in the article as like, food for thought. How would any language forget ClojureScript, say it's some other language? How is that going to become popular? Well, it's, people are going to need to, try something different. And I noticed that, you know, for JavaScript developers, we're really not opposed to trying different things. I mean,
Hmm.
languages are, different than frameworks, but, we try different frameworks, different libraries every day of the week. Um,
Mm.
Different ways of managing React state, every month.
Mm. Right.
We're not opposed to that, and we're criticized for that. I think in some ways.
Mm.
So just sort of an observation is like, yeah, on that, it's like I don't know why more JavaScript developers haven't tried ClojureScript necessarily, because it seems like we have a huge propensity for trying new things.
Right, right. Maybe it's that, but maybe it's that what you mentioned. Maybe there is not enough frameworks in ClojureScript or Clojure ecosystem.
Yeah,
Maybe there will be not much to do, you know?
I mean, yeah, it can get, I don't think it gets boring, but it's certainly different. The experience of, yeah, not as many frameworks out there, not as many things to learn in the ClojureScript community, and you're kind of left with the problem you're trying to solve, um,
All right.
increasingly. But I think that's a good thing overall. Yeah, I mean, I think
Totally agree.
people would talk about, like lack of getting started tutorials and stuff like that is a reason that we haven't seen more JS devs coming from Clojure. I think that's possible.
Hmm.
Certainly, people get hung up on things like parentheses. I think certainly that's just kind of an intractable thing, and you can try and sell people on that. But the reality is, it's very different from anything that people would be used to. And I think it's been said that if all you are doing is trying to find things that are similar to what you're used to, that you're really not going to learn anything new. And that if the thing that
Hmm.
you're used to is something that you're not happy with, that you might be less likely to find something that's a lot better, if all you're looking for is something that's substantially similar to what you already know. I think
Mm.
that's been said.
How about the problem of actually adoption at work? Maybe, a lot of the stuff, since the ecosystem, JavaScript ecosystem is so big, always just pushing this out. Maybe the problem is at work and possibility to use it at work.
I've been able to use it at work. I think we do consulting, and the bar for us is what's the best, what's in the best interest of our customers. What do we want
Hmm.
to teach their developers, and leave them with in terms of a code base. And JavaScript can be really attractive there because there is such a community. There's this huge safety net or backstop to help you if you don't know how to do something, or a huge amount of libraries. Like if you don't want to spend time building a particular UI component,
Mm.
I think in making it easier to use for work for us, I mean, we've been really attracted to things like Shadow CLJS, which is an amazing
Right.
project. And the amount of work that's been put into that in terms of documentation, developer experience, is just kind of staggering. And how seamlessly the interop story has gotten with Shadow CLJS is just, I think something that ClojureScript developers have, looked for a while, where you can just, require this other library, some UI component library from ClojureScript.
Right.
So I think things like that are kind of key. And that's key with Clojure's goal and ClojureScript's goal is that we're running on a host platform, and we should be able to interoperate with the host platform and its ecosystem. So I think since the time that I wrote the article, with the things that have happened with Shadow CLJS, that has gotten way easier.
Yeah, big shout out to Thomas Heller for all his work with Shadow CLJS. Yeah, I think this is an amazing project. I think there's a couple more that really changed the developer experience, and like CLJS DevTools and like the whole reagent, how it works with React, and how it operates. I think this is also a big deal.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I think ultimately, and I have thought about this a fair amount.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't it more popular? Should it be? If it were, relatively easy for somebody to just get plopped down in front of a REPL and, have all the dev set up and just be like, here you go. Here's the experience of, developing interactively at a REPL with an editor connected REPL where you can evaluate code in your editor. If we just if people in the JS community, I think, would just be able to sit down and try it the way that we use it every day at work,
Mm-hmm.
that I think that could just be it. I don't think a lot of people have really tried it or even those that have, for a little bit, have had that experience that we do that makes us love it so much, where can evaluate arbitrary syntax that you've typed into a file, and it just feeds into the whole what is Clojure thing. Well, I'm writing functions, so I can define some data structure, call function that uses that, and see the result printed out in front of me in a second. I don't think anybody, any language, has an experience like that, and that's it's really one of the biggest selling points. I think certainly the thing that I love.
Yeah, I think actually this whole REPL thing is misunderstood by a lot of people, because they always say, well, we have shell, we can also run the stuff. But I think the part that is missed is that no, we are just actually running this while the program is running. We are operating on the system when it's running. It's not like I just run the command and I have the output. And I think this is the part that is sometimes missed. Trying to summarize everything what you said, you believe that actually the problem, or maybe it would help people to adopt Clojure or ClojureScript if there will be more materials to get people get going or get started, or
Maybe not. I don't know. My view is that the language sells itself. It sold itself to me. Like,
mm-hmm.
I can interoperate with JavaScript. I can basically write Java through the same language that compiles to JavaScript. JVM is its own thing. It's you can write multi-threaded servers. I don't think it's the language that's the problem. I mean, maybe there's some things like parentheses. I would like to think it's just that not enough people have tried it, and so in getting people to try it, yeah, tutorials. I think specifically that would, in your editor of choice, like, here are and there's the problem is, I think there's things out here like this. So I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, in your editor of choice, follow these steps. It's quick, it's easy, it's simple, and here you go. You can evaluate code from within your editor.
Yeah, and I think this actually leads us to the place where, when it comes to all the setup in different editors and stuff like this will be part of the next season. So we will just talk about all of the different setups and how people can get easily started and set up everything for ClojureScript development. So Alex, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
If you find this podcast valuable, there are many ways you can support it. You can review it on iTunes or any other platform you're listening to. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can blog about it, discuss it on your own podcast, and you can support it directly by buying my video courses and learning ClojureScript and Clojure at my website, jacekschae.com. That's JACEKSCHAE.com. Thank you for your support of this show.